I think this is very real. The trade war is very real. The trade war is, you could argue that it's necessitated by the twin deficits. And Trump has decided to go all in. He's ideologically committed to this. And he's playing this very dangerous game. And the stock market right now is trading as though nothing's going on. The stock market is trading as though the trade war is already over. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just telling you, the stock market in that respect is making a huge mistake.
David Woo, CEO of David Woo Unbound, a friend of this show, someone we always look forward to having back on every single time. It's really great to see you, David. Really appreciate you taking the time to join me once more.
Love to be on the show. Love to be on the show.
Well, we love having you on the show. And I was just saying, you still have the #1 most viewed video on this channel, and this audience is going to be thrilled to have you back on, because we're airing this, David, as a weekend special. For folks out there watching and listening, we are recording on Friday, May 23rd. It's just after 8 a.m. Eastern. So much is happening in the world. I feel like I say that every single time, but let's start where we always start, David. That big picture, that macro view, that framework in which you are looking at the world today. Where are we right now, and where do you see things headed? And as you know, David, you can take all the time you need to set the table when it comes to that big picture macro view.
Yeah, I mean, big picture. I think, there's big picture, there's small picture, and there's, of course, Trump, right? Because in a way that most of my clients, maybe most of your clients, they all basically focus on Trump. Like, and most of my clients are big hedge funds, big money managers. Markets these days are driven basically by every single word that comes out of his mouth. And I think what happened the last 5 hours, I think is fascinating. And by the way, it's very consistent with something I talked about in my own podcast on my YouTube channel last week, which is why Trump capitulated on China, okay, basically a week ago. If you recall, that was a big deal, right? Trump, after facing off with China for 3 weeks, all of a sudden, Trump didn't just capitulate, he completely capitulated. He lowering the tariff on China from 145% to basically 10%. People talk about 30%, but that 30% includes the 20% fentanyl-related tariff. So let's take that out for a second. But so he hit China with only a 10% reciprocal tariff, which is what he hit everybody else. But what China got that's so different than everybody else is that China got to keep its own 10% tariff on US imports, whereas no other trading partners got to do that, including the UK, by the way. The UK has to accept the 10% tariff on its export to the US, but it did not get to basically put a 10% tariff on imports from the US. And yet Trump said the UK is our greatest ally and is going to get a better deal than the UK. And yet 3 days later, China got a better deal from Trump than the UK. And then I was completely shell-shocked. I was like, what the hell just happened? Why did Trump do this? And I was short the stock market the day it happened, and I was like losing my pants, and I was like, I had to basically rethink this. And then it took me 3 days to sort of recover my composure, and I said, well, listen, it's just too early to jump to the conclusion that Trump's capitulate China was a strategic reassessment about trade war. I think more likely that this was a tactical retreat to buy some time. And I gave three reasons why he might have wanted to buy some time. One of which, of course, is the Russia-Ukraine war, which we can talk about a little bit later. The other one is the face-off with Iran. The third one, of course, is the budget battle in Washington, right? Because as we all know, the debt ceiling is binding. Probably we're going to hit the debt ceiling sometime at the end of July, the beginning of August. Trump is running out of time to get this budget through. So I thought it was very interesting, okay, that as soon as he got back from the Middle East, this past week, he's been completely engaged in the budget negotiation with respect to the House. And as you know, yesterday, the House finally, pushed through his big, beautiful bill. And guess what? Hours after the deal was announced, Trump threatened to hit Apple with a 25% tariff if they don't start making their iPhones in the US. Well, that basically made my day. because that just basically plays to, I'm sorry, basically I'm going to say this, but sort of play to my hypothesis that Trump's capitulation in China was tactical. And then as soon as the budget battle went his way, is a closed chapter, he basically took up his gloves again. So I think this is actually a very important point, which is that, you know what, Trump is, in that sense, with Trump, there's nothing permanent about anything he does. And he's, from that point of view, very tactical. He's like a tactical trader. He's a very short-term trader, and it depends on the resistance, the support, and then he needed to buy some time. He bought himself time, but as soon as he achieved what he needed to do before the deadline was up, he went back to, his old way, which is to basically get aggressive. So I think the stock market is going to go down today, for sure. And then maybe
the futures
the stock
are down
market is
big,
going to keep going down. But this is actually important.
Yeah, it is. It's so interesting. You're David, I think it's fair to say you're kind of known as like a Trump whisperer on Wall Street. I feel like you're one of those guys who understands this man better than anybody else. I mean, you can even go back to your calls when you were at Bank of America, when you were the lone analyst out there on Wall Street who said he was going to win the 2016 election. You nailed the 2020 outcome. You nailed the last one. You've nailed so many calls. Help us understand Trump a bit more. I thought the tactical trader bit was really interesting. What do you think folks misinterpret about him? Because even when you're talking about the trade war, I did watch that video you put out, and it seems like maybe that he's playing some chess moves that people just aren't getting.
I think, listen, there's a lot going on. And again, sometimes, we can sit here and say, well, Trump should have done this, should have done that. I do think, I would say there's one thing I want to basically give him some credit for, and I think this is actually very important. Because Trump talks about lots of different things, but you ask yourself, we can sit here and say, what does Trump want to do? But I think a more important question is, what does he get to do? Because whether you're the president of the United States or you're Julia La Roche with David Woo, for that matter, we all have constraints, right? So it's not just about what you want to do. His question is, what can you do subject to those constraints? Now, I would argue that the biggest constraint that Trump faces, at least with respect to the US economy, is, of course, this huge twin deficit that he's inherited from Biden, right? It's, at the end of the day, it's not Trump's doing, right? That he inherited an economy with a budget deficit of 7% of GDP, which is the highest on record outside of US recession. He's inherited a current account deficit, which is 4% of GDP, which is the highest since the pandemic. So from that point of view, he's inherited massive, basically twin deficits. In fact, the last time the US economy was running such large budget, twin deficits in relative terms was the mid-1980s, okay, under Ronald Reagan, okay. Now, what was interesting, of course, that the twin deficits of the mid-'80s resulted in, of course, the famous Plaza Accord, okay, which was this agreement between the US, Japan, Germany, France, and the UK to devalue the dollar, okay? And then all these countries got involved in terms of intervening, to selling dollars, to drive down the dollar. Now, in a way that you could argue that the solution or the answer to the twin deficits, whatever, the mid-'80s, was the Plaza Accord. I would argue that actually the result of the twin deficits of the Biden's years is Trump's trade war. So in that respect, Trump's trade war and the Plaza Accord, they are very, in a similar way, they are responses to a similar economic, crisis, if you like, okay? To the extent that, whether it's exchange rate devaluation or tariff, what they both achieve is a change in the relative price between US produced goods versus foreign produced goods. So they ought to help change, basically America's basically appetite for imports. So it should help basically reduce the current account, okay, deficit. At the same time, tariff has an added advantage of basically producing additional tax revenue. So it should help also relieve the budget deficit. So I think from that point of view, I think in many ways, when we think about what has Trump done that in some sense is predictable, is consistent with the challenges the US face, and then he could not basically sit on it for too long, was actually his tariff war. I actually think there's something he does that's for real. Some of this stuff is not for real. I'm fairly certain, like, basically wanting Canada to become the 51st state is obviously not real. So that's obviously tactical. But I think when it comes to this trade war, is as strategic as it gets. Now, so from that point of view, I think we have to assume that the trade war is going to be here to stay. I actually think that, I think by now, I think a lot of people would agree that the 10% tariff is going to be the minimum going forward. The only question is it going to be much higher? And then I can tell you right now is that, the 90-day pause that Trump announced on April 9th, is set to expire in 6 weeks' time. And I can tell you right now that the White House has made very, very little progress with other countries in terms of coming to a deal. And then Trump has actually hinted that if he doesn't get a good offer soon, he's going to start basically just arbitrarily pick out some numbers and basically pin it on different countries. Obviously at tariff levels higher than what it is right now, 10%. And that, I think, is going to trigger the next round of trade war. So I think from that point of view, in terms of like what is real, I think this is very real. The trade war is very real. The trade war is, you could argue that it's necessitated by the twin deficits. And Trump has decided to go all in. He's ideologically committed to this. And he's playing this very dangerous game. And the stock market right now is trading as though nothing's going on. The stock market is trading as though the trade war is already over. Mm-hmm. But I'm just telling you, the stock market in that respect is making a huge mistake.
A huge mistake from the stock market. But okay, so as you point out, trade war is here to stay. Stock market hasn't quite recognized that. It's making a mistake. Help us understand from an investor perspective now, if that's the case, how do you want to think about how you might want to be positioned, allocated, just put on that investor lens for a more persistent trade war going forward?
Yeah, I think, Apple is a great example. I mean, just think about this. Apple stock had recovered almost back to its all-time high. It was crazy, right? Because if you think about this, there are 3 or 4 stocks that were particularly vulnerable in, basically given Trump's trade war, if you really take it seriously, one of which is, of course, Apple, right? Because Apple is in the business of manufacturing in China and selling the stuff in the US. I mean, Apple practically makes nothing in the US, right? They design iPhones in the US. Everything is manufactured outside the US, mainly in China. So therefore, and Apple is the most valuable company in the US, and I'm gonna tell you that, right? I mean, so from that point of view, Trump's trade war is absolutely devastating for Apple. And yet, it's actually interesting, the fact that Apple stock has gone pretty much all the way back is a strong indication the market somehow thinks that this trade war is not going to affect Apple, that Trump is going to back down, that Trump doesn't really mean it, that he actually is fine, that Tim Cook is cozying up to him, that Trump already gave an exemption to to cell phones and chips, and that these exemptions. You see, this is the issue. The issue is that because Trump has been take a step forward and take 2 steps backward and forward, and that kind of thing, the market sort of thinks that he's joking or that he just basically, the market no longer takes him seriously in terms of his trade war. And I'm just telling you that what just happened today, that now he's as soon as his budget battle is done, he's now essentially, battling Apple directly, picking out Apple and said, you know what, Tim Cook, okay, you better basically bring this stuff back to the US if you want to sell any phones in the US. Because if Tim Cook, Apple, they were planning to move everything out of China to India, right? And Trump's point is if you remember, Lutnick, right, the Commerce Secretary has said, oh, wow, we're going to basically, he wanted basically Apple to bring all these iPhones assemblies back to the US so that they can be done by robots, okay? That was the dream. And now they're going to India. So things are not, because Trump doesn't have a special hate for China. As far as Trump is concerned, there's only us versus them. And them includes everybody. For him, there's not a huge difference between India and China. So the fact that Apple is going to be producing phones in India as opposed to China, that doesn't really, that he doesn't really care about. What he cares about is for Apple to bring the production back to the US. So what I'm saying to you is that I think this is going to I think the next 6 weeks going to be very interesting because precisely the budget battle is done, right? Because in a way, you could argue that Trump might have rushed into launching his trade war because, like, without the budget being done and then with a debt ceiling, potentially binding around the corner, like, you cannot go out and fight enemies when you've got huge internal problems that are left basically unresolved. Now that the budget is more or less resolved, still has to go through the Senate. I mean, I'm not saying it's completely over yet, but I think we just crossed a major, I would say, milestone. I think Trump now, I think he's going to go back to the trade war. I think you're going to see an escalation. So escalation insofar that I think, I just told you 6 weeks have passed. No countries, with the exception of UK, with which that Trump did a meaningless deal. Like no other country is close to getting a deal or negotiating because they are not willing to basically go down to Trump's terms. And then Trump's going after Apple. I think trade war is going to come back as a bigger theme. And now, if that turns out to be the case, we all know what that basically means, because that would just, you're going to see a replay of what we saw basically post April 2nd. Perhaps in a less dramatic way because the markets already lived through it once. But I would imagine that, like, for example, you would imagine consumer, retailers are going to get hit. Amazon and Walmart of the world are going to get hit, right? Any Apple is going to get hit. It's possible that, the semiconductors sector is going to be hit. And by the way, if we're talking about trade war with Europe, and right now, like nobody's focusing on that basically, that front in terms of the negotiation between Europe and the US on the trade negotiation. Let me tell you this, like that's going to get very, very ugly. There is no way the European Union would accept the same terms that Trump gave to the UK. Okay, and especially given that Trump decided this week not to hit Russia with additional sanctions that Europe asked for, and so from that point of view, I think Europe could very well come after U.S. services industries, the Magnificent Seven, so the likes of even like Microsoft, even like Google, and so on and so forth, will be potentially very vulnerable. And you saw what just happened. The big news yesterday was that BYD has now overtaken Tesla in terms of market share in Europe. So I think from that point of view, in a way, I don't want to scare anybody because, but I do think that in a way that I think the next 6 weeks are going to, I think the next 6 weeks are going to be scarier than the last 6 weeks. Okay. The last 6 weeks, people think, Trump was kidding when he did the trade war, that he doesn't have the stomach for trade war, that he's just going to back down. That was with the market assumption. That's why S&P went back to all-time high, pretty much. But I think now it's a very different story. So I will be definitely much more defensive.
Much more defensive. Okay. Yeah. All right. So, folks, next 6 weeks. Let me ask you this, David. An escalating trade war. How do you win a trade war ultimately? Is there? I know it sounds like kind of a basic question, but. We kind of talk about okay, maybe he won the battle here, capitulated here, and now he's winning again or whatever. What does it look like to actually win a trade war ultimately? And do you see a path where that is possible?
I think it's very difficult to define victory in a trade war because there will always be winners and losers. I mean, even within the same country, right? So in the case of the US, for example, let's just assume, tariff basically kick in. Even let's just assume for a moment, no other countries retaliate against the US tariff. That somehow they all basically lie down and accept the 10% US tariff on their exports to the US and they don't do anything. Even in such a case, what we know what will happen, right? Obviously, the everyday consumers are going to get screwed, right? Because the stuff that we import, especially from low-cost countries like China, for example, is cheap stuff. So from that point of view, there's no doubt it's going to hurt the lower income households more. There's just no doubt about that, right? The stuff that, so from that point of view, I think it will be bad for the low income households. Now, of course, it will be also bad for the importers. It will be also bad for any companies that outsource parts from outside the US in order to basically make a profit, whatever they sell in the US, right? So I would say that trade war in general is not good for business, is definitely not good for the consumers. But you could argue it should be good for manufactured workers, right? I mean, to the extent that if this stuff is not going to be, it's going to be more expensive to import, then more people are going to try to produce it in the US. And therefore, people with, certain skills in manufacturing, their wages are going to basically go up and so on and so forth. So, I mean, so from that point of view, it's difficult to say, we know who the winners and losers are going to be, but it's difficult to say net, whether the country is going to be better off or worse off. But I think, in the case of China, though, I think, China will be definitely worse off. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So like Japan will be definitely worse off, right? So in that respect, any countries that have an export-driven economic models where they export a lot more than they import, then they rely on export growth as an engine of growth for the economy, whether it's China, South Korea, or Japan, or even Germany for that matter. Those countries are going to lose out. I mean, because their workers are going to lose out, their consumers are going to lose out, and their businesses are going to lose out. So I think from that point, in the event of a trade war, you could argue that the US will lose less than lots of other countries. But the difference is these other countries are not fighting with each other. Germany is not going to be fighting with France, with Japan. But whereas the US is taking on the whole goddamn world. So I think from that point of view, net, I would argue it's going to be very tough for the US to come through this victorious.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why I'm surprised. Even like CNN last week said, Trump basically achieved a great victory in a trade war by forcing China to negotiate down. That was like, this is the White House. This is their hype. I mean, obviously that's what they want you to believe. But again, if you look at what they actually agree on, it's not a win. So I think from that point of view, we can sit here and all day and analyze this, but I think, obviously there is no doubt that I think it's going to be painful. Yeah. The only thing you can say, but nevertheless, this is one of these things that I think Trump is, it's actually very interesting because, if you recall, even immediately after the presidency, Trump wouldn't say whether he was going to be seeking a third term or not. You remember that? Mm-hmm. Right? He was open. He said, who knows what the Constitution said. He was open to the possibility of serving for a third term. If you remember 2 weeks ago, he came out and said, it's not going to be a third term for him. And I thought that was a very, very important declaration by him because that's not something that he's going to say lightly. And the reason why he said that, I think, is because he recognizes, that he's going to, because in some sense, he's risking a lot for sort of long-term gains of the countries. It's possible whatever benefits his policies may even bring about may not even happen under his presidency. So he's not even, he's trying to put down the gauntlet. I mean, to the extent he's telling people, you know what? Don't think I'm going to flinch because I'm going to be seeking a re-election. Therefore, I want everything to be going hunky-dory before I seek re-election. But rather, he wants people to believe that he is all in. And then whatever it takes, he's totally committed. And I think that's actually a pretty effective bargaining position for him, which is he needs to buy credibility, especially given the flip-flop that we've seen over the last couple of months.
Gold prices have been breaking all-time highs this year, but price appreciation isn't the only way to profit from owning gold. You can earn a yield on gold paid in gold without selling your gold or silver. Unlike dollar yields that can be slashed or even go negative, a yield on gold paid in gold means more ounces in your account every month, not paper. Monetary Metals is revolutionizing the way people invest in gold and silver. Instead of paying to own the metal, now you can get paid to own it. Right now, there are opportunities for you to earn 4% on gold, paid in gold in their marketplace. The interest you earn is paid in ounces of physical gold or silver, which you get in addition to any price appreciation that comes from gold and silver during the year. The question is this: why earn in dollars when you can earn in gold? Join thousands of investors who are earning a yield in physical gold and silver every month with Monetary Metals. Visit monetary-metals.com/Julia to learn more. You mentioned too, you want to be defensive. I take it that probably means wanting some gold in your portfolio. Whatever you can share, whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Sure.
How when you say defensive, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different ways to think about defensive, right? I mean, because there are a lot of I think you could be long treasuries, right? You could be short stocks, you could be long VIX. But although VIX, I think you want to be very careful. It's only really for professionals. I think, how you actually trade this and which level and that kind of thing is very important. I would simply say that, for average retail investors, if you made a lot of money, basically picking the bottom, the last 6 weeks, you should probably take some money off the table rather than trying to go for the home run. Okay, and I think that's a very important thing. I think we're going to be in a way you could argue that we're now trading the range, right? It's like, well, when the stock market's trading all-time high, Trump feels like he could afford to basically be less friendly for the market to the extent that he could get tough on trade war and stuff like that the market doesn't like. But when the market goes down, Trump gets nervous about the economy, recession, and he's going to try to talk up the market, right? So in a way that we got to basically understand that Trump actually, if you think about it that way, we're probably going to be trading the range, and you want to sell high and buy low. But I think gold is a very different story. I happen to be long gold right now, and I'm long gold not so much against the US dollar, but against the euro. And I'll tell you the logic of that.
Interesting, yeah.
And so I'm long gold against the euro, which I think is a very good trade. At least, I'm not trying to give investment advice here, but the point here is I'm just telling you what I'm doing. But the point here is that I think, this has also somewhat to do with Trump, which is that I think Trump's biggest foreign policy blunder was trying to end the Ukraine war, as his priority in the first 3 months of his presidency. I think, I thought that he didn't understand, the reaction functions of both sides. I think he had very unrealistic expectations in terms of how much leverage he had on Putin and Zelensky and so on and so forth. And as a result, I think I've been proved right in the last 3 months to the extent that Putin finally told Trump, thank you, but no thank you. This is after Trump was bending backward, forward, even willing to sell Ukraine down the river. But Putin gently said, thank you, but no thank you. So from that point of view, I think Trump completely overestimated the challenge of ending this war. Now, as a result of Trump's failure, the last 3 months with respect to this war, the Russia hawks, whether they're in Washington or in Europe, are back in the driver's seat, right? You could argue that the Russia hawks in Washington, people like Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, who now said that he's amassed a veto-proof majority to hit Russia with more sanctions. I think these people, sort of gave Trump enough rope to go hang himself to the extent for 3 months they kept their mouth shut. They knew that Trump was going to go nowhere. They didn't tell him that. They want him to sort of find out for himself. But now that Trump has crashed and burned over this war and been humiliated by Putin, arguably, all of a sudden, Lindsey Graham could be rolling out these big sanctions against Russia and calling for more aid for Ukraine. And meanwhile, in Europe, Starmer and Macron, they're talking about putting French and British troops in the Western Ukraine. You've got the new German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who's talking about sending long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine and so on and so forth. And then, so all of a sudden, I think in a way that Trump's peacemaking effort, has now essentially put us at this point of a huge escalation ahead, in my humble opinion.
Would you
and
say?
I think and I think that is going to be a big story of the next 6 weeks. Because I think Putin is about to essentially launch an all-out offensive to take over the rest of the Donbass that is not yet under Russian control. And I think Russia also knows it's running out of time. So Europe is now just hit Russia with additional sanctions this week. The only question now is whether Trump will follow suit. Now, Trump said on Monday that, that sanctions might make things worse, was suggesting that he didn't want to basically, hit Russia with sanctions. But on Tuesday, he said they're still deliberating what to do because you've got someone like, Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio, who are saying that we cannot allow Russia to get away with this. And so from that point of view, right now, well, Trump is waiting for a response from Putin in terms of the ceasefire terms that Russia, wants to see, in black and white terms. And then if that goes nowhere, which I'm fairly confident it will go nowhere, I think that's when Trump may have to pivot on Russia. And when that happens, I think gold will do very well. And then the euro will do very poorly because anything that, essentially raises geopolitical risk in Europe is going to be bad for the European assets. I mean, the market is very long European assets. So I like being long gold versus the euro as a play on, essentially renew escalation of geopolitical risk in Europe.
Would you say, and it's interesting, one, I would love to hear, do you look in 6-week time periods, or are you just thinking like the next 6 weeks, given the combination of things, whether it's this geopolitical risk, escalation of trade wars, or is it just because of everything happening in the next 6 weeks?
The reason why I'm saying 6 weeks is because, we have to, let me take it back for a second, perhaps. First of all, the Russian offensive has been very slow, okay, in the last 3 months. Especially, you could argue in all of April, they were dragging their feet. Partly because, guess what? In eastern Ukraine, in April and the beginning of May, it's the rainy season. And then you have all the snow melting, that kind of thing. So they call it basically the muddy season. So therefore, even if Russia wanted to, they couldn't really launch a real land offensive. I mean, to the extent that their personnel carriers, their tanks would have been basically stuck in mud. So from that point of view, the next 6 weeks, when the ground is getting harder, tanks are going to be able to roll more quickly, that's when they're actually going to basically move. And also because, I don't think Lindsey Graham is going to give Trump another 6 weeks. So from that point of view, I think a lot is riding on that. Because again, we have to realize this is where the constraint is, right? We said Trump, he's the president of the United States, but he faces constraints. And then there is no doubt in my mind that one such constraint is the military-industrial complex, right? I mean, it's a $1 trillion industry in the U.S., right? The budget deficit, the defense spending and so on and so forth. And then there are people who really believe that, that we need to basically defeat Russia so that we can defeat China and so on and so forth. I mean, this is a much more serious issue. And I think from that point of view, I don't think Trump has 6 weeks to buy time from these people, because as soon as he gets the final word from Putin, and I think it's not going to be terms that he can accept, I think that's when things will have to start to happen. But I agree with you. Like, I think Trump will Trump will try to buy time. It's just like he's been trying to buy time on Iran. That's another thing, right? I mean, you can see the way Trump plays. Like, he's trying to basically minimize. He wants to choose the battle he wants to fight. He doesn't want other people to dictate the battle he's going to fight. But I think in the case of Russia, Ukraine, because he threw himself in this peacemaking process so quickly, okay, and having failed, in a way that he has now no choice but to basically defer to those vocal voices around him that want to take it in another direction. So I think from that point of view, this is going to be a real litmus test. But again, I think this is not so, my guess next 6 weeks is not so much because I think, Trump really wants to really have an out with Putin over the next 6 weeks. But I think a lot of the forces around him, I think, are going to leave him with very little time to drag this thing out.
Yeah. It's always, there's that old adage, like sell in May and go away. It sounds to me like this summer is going to keep a lot of investors and traders on their toes. A lot of things happening.
I think so.
Yeah.
I definitely think so.
Yeah. Do you think the Ukraine-Russia, that's going to be if you had to stack rank macro risk, do you think that's the biggest one?
I would say the biggest, I think there are several big ones. I think the biggest one is obviously, I think the bigger one even is, as I said, on July 9th, right? I mean, July 9th is the end of the 90-day pause that Trump announced on April 9th, right? I mean, with respect to the reciprocal tariffs, right? So literally, I think from that point, July 9th is going to be a very big day. I mean, it might even come up, I don't even know it's July 9th, maybe July 8th, whatever it is. You just count 90 days from basically April 9th. I think, to the extent that there are 150 countries that have to agree to deals with the U.S. between now and then. And I'm telling you right now, I don't see one country that's even in the line that's even getting close. I think things are going to happen between now and then.
Yeah.
So I think that's my first major concern, which is that, Trump's own self-imposed deadlines coming up, and then he's not going to be able to back down again without having his credibility completely blown up. So I think that's one major issue on the trade war front. I think the second issue on the front is Russia and Ukraine, to the extent that when will Trump be forced? Because also basically, like at this point, Trump will have to either decide to hit Russia with more sanctions or not. If he does that, obviously we'll blow things up with Russia. And more importantly, he will have to decide whether to send more arms and munitions to Ukraine. That will also blow things up. So that's the second thing. There's a third thing, which is sort of like picking up steam, is of course Iran. Okay. Now, it's actually very interesting with respect to Iran, the way things have gone, right? I mean, just think about this. Like, it's pretty amazing. It was always very amazing to me that Steve Witkoff, Trump's friend, the real estate developer, has met with Putin like 3 times, has met with the Iranians 4 times. This is a real estate guy. I mean, he's been acting as though he's like the Secretary of State. And it's very clear, based on, these meetings that he's led, that the guy really didn't know very much. And so from that point of view, it's created a lot of confusion, especially on the part of Russia and Iran, about like what the US was open to and so on and so forth. But forget about that for a moment. But with Iran, okay, this is, I think Trump's appeasement of Iran is also coming to a dead end. And I'll say why that's the case. Because if you recall, okay, like Witkoff and Trump, for weeks, they were going on and on about the fact that, it's okay for Iran to have a civilian nuclear reactor, okay, without specifying any other strings attached to it, okay? And the Iranian took that, they understood that to mean that the US will be okay for them to continue to enrich uranium up to 3.67%, which is enough for basically powering a nuclear reactor, civilian nuclear reactor. But that is not the understanding of people who have been dealing with Iran issues for many years in Washington, including Marco Rubio, right? What Rubio's and others have said, and this is where Rubio, it's actually very interesting, right? Rubio, I'm sure Rubio was not pleased about the fact that, that the Steve Witkoff guy was doing his job, right? I mean, he should have been him meeting with Putin and not basically Steve Witkoff. Who's Steve Witkoff? He should have been him who'd been running these negotiations with Iran. And yet it was Steve Witkoff. So Rubio was like, very patient because he didn't want to blow up with Trump, right? Because Rubio wants to run for president one day. And he's doing this to get it on his resume and this and that. So he doesn't want to basically already be fired, like after like 3 months, like what happened to Mike Waltz. That's not what he quit his Senate seat to do. But the point here is this. So imagine you're Rubio, and Rubio finally put his foot down. So 2 weeks ago, Rubio was like doing every single interview. Okay, he was like doing every TV interview, invitation he got, he did an interview, like newspaper interview. And in these interviews, he kept talking about one thing, okay, which is that we will never allow Iran to keep its enrichment capabilities. Okay, so which is very different. It's a very different direction what Witkoff was saying, what even Trump was implying in his public statement. And then, he kept at it for 2 weeks. Until 10 days ago, Trump all of a sudden fell on the same page with Rubio and said, yes, that, dismantling Iran's nuclear capabilities, enrichment capabilities, is a requirement for any deal. And the next day, Witkoff did an interview with Breitbart and used the same word, dismantlement, to describe what is required in such a deal. And guess what? 2 days later, over the weekend, last weekend, the supreme leader of Iran called Trump a liar and said that this whole thing was phony, that basically US was not serious about peace and this and this and that. It does look like all of a sudden, there's not going to be another round of negotiation, okay? Because all of a sudden, so this is actually fascinating. So what now is coming to is that if Iran is not willing to negotiate, then Trump will have to go back to his initial threats, which is now sanctions, if not to basically hit Iran militarily. So I think that's another major risk to the extent that Trump, again, both with Russia, it's actually very interesting. With both Russia and Iran, Trump has been pursuing this, basically appeasement policy, if you like. Maybe also to buy time with other things and so on and so forth. But with Russia, definitely we're now at a dead end. Iran, it looks like we're at a dead end. When you're at a dead end, you have to pivot. Because once your carrot is not working, you'll be forced to basically play with a stick. And that is what's going to be next. And so from that point of view, I think, this is going to get very interesting because this summer we might see oil volatility picking up as well. Because if there are going to be sanctions on Iran or, and it's really hit on Iran, anything is possible. But it is very, very interesting that all these dynamics are all happening at the same time right now.
Yeah.
That's why, as I said, I think there is something to be said about sell in May and come back in October.
It's so interesting. Yeah, the confluence of these different events. Question for you: do sanctions work?
I think certain sanctions work. Then the question is because some countries, let's talk about this for a second, right? So there are sanctions on Russian oil export, right? And yet they haven't really stopped Russia's ability to export oil. Because for a very long time it was, listen, the sanctions, you cannot sanction countries from buying oil from Iran, right? From Russia or from Iran for that matter. Because China is the biggest importer of oil from, Russia and Iran. If you say China, you cannot sanction China for buying oil from Iran and Russia because that could be a declaration of war, by the way. So then you have to go beyond what just sanctions against the countries that are supposed to doing this. But in the case of Russia, then they thought, oh wow, we're going to sanction the ships. Any ships that will be carrying Russian oil will be subject to sanctions to the extent that, if you recall, this was a scheme that was cooked up by Janet Yellen, which was they didn't want to completely remove Russian oil supply from the market, right? This is actually the irony of this, right, Julia? It's you want to sanction Russia? Russia is a major oil exporter, but if you were to stop Russian oil export cold turkey, then oil prices are going to go to $100 a barrel. Then you're going to suffer yourself, okay? So from that point of view, total sanction on Russia was never going to be the thing to do. So therefore, they cook up the scheme where they're going to say, okay, fine, we're going to, any ship that's going to be carrying Russian oil will have to will be allowed to carry Russian oil if they know that the contract, okay, the price on the oil contract to buy Russian oil, sets the price at lower than $60. Okay. The idea is that Russia should get less for its oil than the international price. Okay. Now, what happened, of course, is that, Putin managed to get around this by assembling his own shadow fleet. So the Russians went around paying cash for every basically Asian tankers or whatever. They just basically assemble a few hundred ships that are now sailing around the world delivering Russia's own oil. Now the Europeans are trying to hit they're trying to target these so-called shadow fleets. Okay, which is not that easy because if you seize one, Estonia tried to basically seize one of these shadow fleet, I think last week, and then the Russians went in there with special forces. This stuff can get very, very dangerous very quickly because the Russians see these as basically confiscating Russian assets. They will take steps. So that's why it's not so simple. And this is why it's actually very interesting because Lindsey Graham's sanction proposal is about hitting countries that are doing business with Russia, which obviously will be China. So again, it comes down to the whole thing with China again. So this is why at this point, if you want to hit Russia with more sanctions, it will have to be fairly dramatic. It won't just be some small cheese thing unless you want it to be small cheese. But I think we know when it comes to Trump, he doesn't do small things. So if he is persuaded we need to now, essentially use the stick on Russia, believe me, they're going to pull out a big stick. And it's that makes me very nervous. And that should make the market very nervous. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, as you point out, the next 6 weeks are going to get scary for markets. So Oh gosh. Let me bring up this with you because I don't know, David, if you ever look at prediction markets, but we do on the program and we do bring up prediction markets with our friends over at Kalshi. And then just kind of going back to the expiration of the pause on tariffs coming up on July 9th. I was just looking at one of the markets on Kalshi, which countries will Trump make new trade deals with this year? And just even looking at the probabilities here, it looks like the highest probabilities are 38% of a deal with South Korea, 36% of a deal with India, and 21% for a deal with Vietnam. Just looking at the current state of that prediction market, of course, before 2026, so January 1st of 2026.
But because in a way, like at the end of 2026 is already like, that's like a long time away because right now we're talking about like the next 6 weeks, right?
Yeah, totally.
Because like, like I mean, if you are an investor and you care about your money, you care about not losing money. I mean, that's the call you have to make, which is that what are the chances, Trump is going to get a deal with a major country or a group of major countries very soon? Because I mean, you're talking 150 countries, right? And there are several issues here that I want to just basically talk about with respect, because there are not a lot of names that have come up, right? I mean, because like there's Japan, there is like South Korea. But let me just tell you like where South Korea and Japan are interesting, okay? Now South Korea, just so that you know, I mean, there's an election coming up, okay, next month, okay, in June. And the president is going to be reelected. I mean, it's a presidential election. And let me tell you this right now, that the head of the opposition party is right now in the lead, okay, in the polls, by actually quite a big margin. And guess what? The opposition party is anti-American, okay, in South Korea. Okay, they're pro-union and anti-capitalist. In fact, the opposition party wants to basically essentially get closer to North Korea. They actually want to get closer to China. So from that point of view, I think whether South Korea, I think there's very little chance that we're going to get a deal between US and South Korea before the presidential election. And after the presidential election, if we end up getting, essentially, sort of a center-left liberal, basically president, I think the chance of a deal are even lower. And actually, this is very interesting, Julia. I want to basically say this because if you think about this, and this is probably something I didn't expect. I definitely did not expect this. I'm in the prediction business, and there are a lot of things about this presidency has surprised me greatly, and in a way that, and I don't think Trump has played as well in this presidency as he did in his first term, but that's a story maybe for another time. But I think what is very, very interesting, and I think this is something that people are going to be talking about for a very long time, which is to what extent the Donald Trump presidency is crushing the conservative movement practically worldwide, right? Now, there's no doubt, I mean, between us, right? We all know that, before Trump, became president, the Conservative Party in Canada was running well ahead in the poll. After Trump got in, guess what? And wanted to annex Canada. Next thing you know, basically the Conservatives lost by a big margin, okay? Australia, okay, when Trump came into office, the Conservative Party was basically also leading the poll, and they just got defeated badly. In fact, with the head of the Conservative Party losing his own seat, okay, in the election 2 weeks ago, okay? And in Germany, like I would argue that, Elon Musk was going on and about like how like Germany this and that he was supporting the AfD. Let me tell you this, if it hadn't been for all this Trump this, Elon Musk that, which was seen by the Germans as tampering or interfering with German election, German democracy, I guarantee you the AfD would have done a lot better in the election we had early in the year, which would deprive the SPD from, and then the CDU from being able to form the government they have. I'm just telling you, it's actually very interesting what's going on. If you look at, it's actually very interesting to the extent that Trump has actually, uplifted his adversaries, okay, in other countries. people who are against Trump, center left, liberal, who see Trump as a bad force, they've all been in power by Trump's presidency so far. That Mark Carney, who basically ran on, I'm going to make Trump pay for everything he said and doing to Canada, he now sees himself as a leader of an internationalist camp to basically take on Trump. So I'm just saying it's actually very interesting what's going on here, because what we're seeing already is this backlash, which means that the ability Trump is going to get close deals, trade deals with countries that easily, you know what? Trump can dream on, but I think the damage has been done, and that's why it's going to be difficult.
That is so interesting. But also, like when you mentioned earlier, though, he's kind of trying to go all in and throw down the gauntlet here too. I didn't think about that side of it. And as you mentioned, like there's more of the story here that you can talk about next time, but he hasn't done as well in 2.0. So interesting. Do you think then he's kind of got to do all this, pack it in early because of the midterms coming up as well, and the chance that the House is probably going to go to the Democrats?
Listen, I mean, I think, the midterm is still like, whatever. I mean, it's just like still a long time away. I mean, political terms and economic terms, like we're talking about like a year and 9 more months. I mean, like whatever, eight more months. It's a long time away. I refuse to think that it's all about the midterm. Like,
Okay,
you just won the presidency. You got elected to get things done. Like, why are you already doing things with the? I don't believe that. I don't believe the midterm is as important as people think it is. And I just think that I hate to say this, and I think nobody is perfect. I mean, I want to say this. You're not perfect. I'm not perfect. No. Trump's not perfect. Maybe he's less perfect than we are. But the thing is this, I think he got a bit carried away by his victory, right? I mean, because, if you remember, I'm not saying, listen, he did something amazing, right? I mean, he came back from political exile to run, and then with everything thrown against him, whatever, that the guy won very decisively. And in surviving 2 assassinations, right? I mean, he said, if you recall, like after his first, he said, he became convinced that he was saved by God, okay, from the assassination attempt in order to make America great again. And I don't doubt that he really believes that. Like, I think Trump really feels like he's a man of destiny. But I think the problem is this: if you look at the history of mankind, anybody who claims to have close affinity to God tend to be very susceptible to making big mistakes, because they tend to overestimate, okay, their leverage, their whatever power that is. So I think Trump did not, I think, I really do believe that, I think there are a lot of good things about his program and policies. But I think any good programs and good policies require very careful sequencing. I think sequencing is the most important thing about doing and implementing right policies. And I think the sequencing of policies under Trump has been terrible, okay? I think, it's really been terrible. And I think this whole rush to get everything out at the same time without any thought about sequencing and what, and that was, I think that's been very costly. And I think, I think the Russia-Ukraine is a great example, but there are many other examples. I think what's happened to DOGE is just absolutely, and then by the way, I don't just basically blame Trump. I think Elon Musk is an idiot, by the way. I voted for Trump partly because Elon Musk, I thought I was voting for Elon Musk.
Yeah.
But
wait, I want to hear more on that, on the DOGE bit. Yeah.
How can someone like Elon Musk, right? I mean, this is why we all think, I've always think, well, America is going to be incredible with someone like Elon Musk on their side. Like, I mean, this guy is a genius. He's a whatever engineer. Like, how can someone like that, okay, go out and said that he was going to cut $2 trillion, okay, from US spending every year, and then go down to 1 trillion, and then now down to $150 billion. And my own numbers suggest that he might have cut altogether maybe $50 billion. How can you go from 2 trillion to 50 billion? I mean, unless American capitalism is all about talking big. But I think Elon Musk has been a huge disappointment. I have to believe that even Trump probably has been very disappointed by Elon Musk. Because Elon Musk was making it sound like there is fraud everywhere in the government, that his team is going to go in there. There's all these millions of dead people who are collecting social welfare, that his people, geniuses, are going to go in there and they're going to end it all. How much fraud have they found? Not so much. I mean, this is the most incredible thing. And now, with his tail between his leg, he's now fleeing from the scene of the crime. Okay, very convenient to say he wants to go back to his business because DOGE has done shit. Okay, and I think this is very, very disappointing. I think, listen, I was sure Trump completely trusted Elon Musk, and then I think, this is why Trump was like, even let Elon Musk have, you remember that picture in the Time magazine that Elon Musk was the guy who was sitting at Trump's desk? Right? Trump had to put up with that. Elon Musk show up in his meeting, the Oval Office with his boy, okay, climbing as though there was his own living room. Like Elon Musk, that man talks so big and deliver nothing. And that basically makes him, I think, I'm glad. I'm sure Trump is glad he's gone, actually. Okay. But that was a huge disappointment. Very, very big disappointment. No, Elon Musk is going to tell you, oh, it's because the courts overturned this and that. But you know what? Elon Musk had all the time in the world. In fact, actually, after the election, he said that he had assembled this team of lawyers, specialists, that they're going to come up with these things that are going to be immune to basically legal overturn. So he had all the time in the world. He had all the money in the world to make sure that whatever he did was going to stick. And now nothing's happened. And that has to be the biggest, the biggest disappointment. I mean, if this had happened to anybody else, people would have said like, this is, but I just think that I think people need to be reminded about what this huge, that how much Elon Musk overpromise and totally underdeliver. And this has been biggest disappointment of the Trump presidency so far, as far as I'm concerned.
I have to say, David, it is so awesome having you back on here. And I know I've taken way too much of your time. I've probably kept you over time, but I have to say, it's just been a fascinating conversation just listening to you. I always learn from you every time you come on. I know this audience does as well. Before I let you go, take the final few moments here. Let folks know where they can go support your work. David Woo Unbound, subscribe to your work as well. And any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave this audience to think about, the floor is all yours.
Sure. I mean, listen, I think the world is a mess. And I think there's a lot of, people. I mean, I think so often people are talking motivated by their politics, their ideology, and so on and so forth. So my YouTube channel, David Woo Unbound, what I'm trying to do is trying to lead with facts and let you decide to basically what is right or wrong. At the end of the day, I don't really care which side wins. What I care is who's making the smart move and how can we as investors monetize. And I think that's probably the best way to think about the world is through your own money, your pockets, because it's the only way people actually are forced to think objectively. So check me out, check it out, my YouTube channel, David Woo Unbound, where if you're interested in my investment strategy. You can also check out my retail subscription site at davidwoounbound.com.
David Woo, CEO of David Woo Unbound. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time, all of your knowledge, your wisdom, helping all of us learn and get better. Really appreciate you. We appreciate you being a friend of this channel. Thank you so much. And until next time, be well. Thanks again, David.
Thank you so much.